Hello, my name's Nigel Thorne, and I'm concerned about the apparent indoctrination of the Welsh Government in gender identity ideology. There are three basic positions that are held in relation to the treatment of gender dysphoria in children. The first, no child is trans. Gender dysphoria is a mental health condition. The role of the clinician is to help the client understand the underlying causes. This position is movingly articulated by trans woman Rene, author of a book, Don't Get on the Plane, How Sex Change Ruined My Life. In a compelling and moving speech, Jax explained that he had a difficult childhood. At the age of 14, he came across and immersed himself in a book by Harry Benjamin, the founder of WPath. At the time, the book convinced him that there is such a thing as a gender that is independent of one's biological sex. He started on cross-sex hormones at 17. He became the first transgender police officer in the world, but suffered terrible discrimination from his colleagues. His body has been severely impacted by a lifetime on wrong-sex hormones. Jax explained the reasons for the relatively poor mental health experienced by trans people.
What it is not bigotry, but biology. Our biology is a binary sex biology, too. There's some other stuff, but it's two. And you say, well, there's gender. Let me explain gender to you folks. John Money was an Australian from Wellington, and he came up here and he was doing research. He was the first doctor who really looked at this condition scientifically. In 1955, he wrote a paper identifying gender as a concept to convey this confusion he saw in his patients. 14 years later, Harry Benjamin wrote The Transsexual Phenomena, in which he extrapolated and did a nice little chart. He loved charts, which showed the range of gender. Then the following year, Robert Jesse Stoller wrote his book, Sex and Gender. And Benjamin was too old school. He came from Germany. He was Jewish. English was not his first language. Robert Jesse Stoller was a true American scientist, and his lingo resonated with the American society. So when he wrote his second book, The Transsexual Phenomena, in which he said gender is a range of things and a rainbow, it caught on in the lay person. It caught on, and now we believe that gender can be separate from anatomy. There has been no scientific research, hard science, that indicates anything like that. Nobody's done it because it's just accepted as true.
Jax sees gender dysphoria as a mental health condition, and children are being over-medicalized.
It is a mental health issue. All of my friends, and I've been deep involved with the transsexual community, have mental illness. And so when you hear them say, well, it's because we're not loved by our mothers. No, it's because there's other things going on here that medicine has dropped the ball. So the solution, the first thing to stop this epidemic, and it looks from all indication to double every year for the foreseeable future. There's 3,500 this year. Next year, we're looking at 8,000 in the US. In the UK, they are getting 50 gender teenagers every day wanting sex changes. This is epidemic, and the AMA won't talk about it, the APA won't talk about it. And the solution, first and foremost, let's not create more. My solution is let's stop the surgical putting kids into the sex change system and prohibit kids under the age of 18 from having puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and sex changes. You have to stop it's like you can't fix a dam, you can't deal with the flooding if you haven't fixed the dam. We have to stop the dam first and foremost.
An alternative position that is held is that some children are trans, and some simply have gender dysphoria. The role of the clinician is to distinguish those who are true trans from those who are not. This position was held by Dutch endocrinologist Louis Gooren. Gooren trained in internal medicine and endocrinology at the Free University Hospital of Amsterdam. He did further training in endocrinology at Johns Hopkins University, including work in sexual medicine with John Money. Gooren takes as fact John Money's belief that we all have a gender that is independent of our sex bodies. This is not a scientific belief because there is no objective test that can determine our gender. It is purely subjective. It was Gooren who initiated the treatment of gender-distressed children with puberty blockers, a treatment that became known as the Dutch Protocol. Healthcare researcher Zhenya Abbruzzese explains the thinking that led to the Dutch Protocol.
And when I began to study the Dutch Protocol, I really started going upstream to try to understand. So what are the origins of it? And it's actually a really fascinating story. And by the way, I don't claim to be the most advanced historian of gender medicine. I'll just share what I observed by reading the studies. It seems to stem back. So one key notion that I was really struck by is that the very rationale for pediatric gender transition was by the Dutch clinicians, and again, the Netherlands as the birthplace, is that gender transition did not work very well for adults. So it is not that we started doing it to teenagers because it worked so well in adults and we said, wow, this is working so well, so let's just start doing it sooner. It's just the opposite. It was that it did not work very well in adults. And for that reason, the Dutch researchers said, okay, well, maybe we got to them too late. Let's try this earlier, kind of like as an early intervention, almost like a preventive measure. Gender transition as a preventive measure.
What sort of year are you talking when you're saying this?
Yeah, so the Dutch began to experiment with youth gender transition in the late 1980s, from my reading of the literature. And incidentally, that was exactly within a year or two of when they published their first ever outcome study of the adult transitioners. Okay. And it was around the same time. And the study of the adult transitioners is actually really, really interesting because what they found is there is moderate to marked sense of loneliness in 50% of the patients.
Wow.
High rates of unemployment, 36% unemployment in trans men and 60% unemployment in trans women, and lack of partner, 33% in trans men and 59% in trans women. So what they're saying is when we look at how these patients are functioning, they're saying they're glad they did it, but they're not functioning very well. In addition, they know that 1 in 35 trans men attempted suicide and 15 in 103 trans women attempted suicide 2 to 5 years after transition.
Jesus.
And they're saying that the participants' attempts were motivated by psychosocial problems associated with the feelings of loneliness and depression. And so in their conclusions, the authors are very sober. They're saying this is no panacea, this is not solving problems. There's also an interesting dichotomy. They describe how the patients say they're happy or they're glad they did it, but they're not doing very well. And they note that actually when the patients subjectively report that they're glad they did it, there's no relationship about where they're in the transition journey, whether they're just starting, they're middle, or they completed. So it seems like just embarking on that journey already sort of gives them a sense of subjective well-being. We're doing something about it, and yet none of the objective measures are improving. And
we must one day get people to do I'd love to see a lot of studies around regret, the psychology of regret, who does regret, anything big in life.
Yeah.
You know, that in itself is a whole kind of thought process. Who says, I regret moving to America, getting married or whatever? Usually we just assimilate our massive decisions into our, this is where I am, I'm glad I did it, it made me the person I am. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. But it's an interesting point that people don't rest on enough.
Abbruzzese goes on to explain the thinking that established the criteria for assessing the outcome of medical treatment.
And at that point, they decide, or at least they opine, that it really a lot of weight should be put on the subjective measures. And the way they justify it is they say, well, the sense of gender incongruence is a subjective feeling. Therefore, subjective measures of happiness, that they're glad they did it, should trump the lack of improvement in objective measures. That's kind of where they're leaning. And you see how the philosophy of this group and the same very people that studied the adult transition initiated the practice of childhood transition. So then you see this leap where they're saying, well, clearly the patients are happy they did it. By the way, nobody talks about the huge dropout rates, because people who drop out may not nearly be as happy. So there's an enormous sort of blinder already in the thinking process, a set of blinders, but still they're saying, well, it seems like it's the right thing because they say they're glad they did it, yet they're not functioning well. And that is because we got to them too late. Okay. So now let's just go upstream.
I want to pause here before we get into that, because there are kind of two big things that I just want to highlight. First of all, we're already aware that both the condition the patient's presenting with and the measures by which we determine whether their treatments are successful or not are all in the realm of the subjective. That is what makes this, I think, so vulnerable to things going off the rails. That's the first thing that's just really interesting to think about.
Wow.
They came in with a subjective experience. We're going to treat it with an objective medical measure, but then we also are going to use the subjective determination about the effectiveness. And then number two, the loneliness piece feels really important, because whether or not being medically operated on and taking hormones determines that you will necessarily be lonely isn't clear to me. So I am perfectly willing to entertain perhaps an activist position, which is, well, society was probably very rejecting of these people because many of them were male, many of them transitioned late into adulthood. They probably, visibly looked like someone who you can't quite understand what their biology is, and they might have been severely excluded from society, from dating pools, etc. And I'm just willing to entertain that today, people who transition may have a lot more opportunity to find connection and love and socializing. So from that premise, I just want to give a little bit of credit to the thinking here.
Yeah.
I could understand why the researchers thought, well, it's because the aesthetic outcomes were poor that they experienced loneliness and rejection and all these things. Now, I don't think that's the only piece of the story. That's why we're here doing this podcast in the first place. But I just want to kind of point out that it is weird. They tried something, it worked terribly, and then they're like, well, let's try it even sooner. I think maybe the rationale was, if we intervened sooner, these people could seamlessly move into their roles as women or men or whatever.
That was exactly the rationale. And it actually makes perfect sense when you follow it. And so, which is all the more interesting about the fact that the pediatric transition was launched at exactly the same time as the adult data was being analyzed. And so then, as Survive constructed the timeline in my own, trying to make sense of this journey of the field, is essentially at that point the Dutch researchers are saying, and again, it's the same group of people, are saying, all right, let's go upstream, let's do it earlier. But of course, we know that the earlier you go, the more risk you incur, because these are younger individuals. And of course, identity development is actively undergoing in adolescence. So they were very aware of the risks. And so the the way they justify, from what I can tell, is that they're saying, okay, there are really two types of young people. So moving from mature adults to young people, there are two types of young people that could have gender dysphoria. One is the true transsexual, and that's essentially kind of a diagnosis of hindsight in a way, right? So they will always be this way. And that we'll know they're true transsexual later, but they are true transsexuals because they'll always be that way.
Huh.
And then there's just young people with gender dysphoria who are struggling with maybe their sexuality, with their developing bodies, maybe some mental illnesses interfering. So these are not true transsexuals. These, what would be called false positives, were they to be transitioned. And so the Dutch clinicians then make a very interesting bet. They say that they can't tell apart a true transsexual adolescent from just a garden variety gender dysphoric adolescent who is not a true transsexual. And the way they tell the difference is by looking, there's several factors, but the most important one is to see when their gender dysphoria began.
Okay.
And how it developed. So when they're looking at a 15-year-old, if that 15, who's gender dysphoric, if that 15-year-old has been cross-sex, extreme cross-sex identified, so not in the middle, not non-binary, but opposite, extremely cross-sex identified from what they called toddlerhood on, and if their gender dysphoria persisted, not only persisted, but intensified during adolescence and stayed that way through the first few years of pubertal changes into their body, that will likely be a true transsexual. Anybody who is not like that is not and should not be transitioned.
Did they reference any specific information or where they got this arbitrary timeline cutoff thing? Where are they getting this idea?
Great, yeah.
So that's the question I've really been trying to understand. I see no evidence that it's ever been studied. It was just an opinion of a couple of clinicians that worked with the adult populations, interviewed them, asked them about their memories. Maybe it was informed by seeing a few adolescents that continued to wish to pursue gender reassignment in early 20s. But there is no study, there is no proof. And in fact, my assessment of sort of how the age came up. So at first it was more conceptual, like, 15, 16, like they're, it has a lot to do with the laws in the Netherlands. For example, how did the age of puberty blockers at 12 come up? Well, in the Netherlands, at 12 is the youngest age a young person can participate in medical decision making. So instead of saying if they're still gender dysphoric at 12, they're true transsexual, it was more along the lines of at 12, they can now participate in medical decision making.
Wow.
So 12 becomes the age. But actually, when you read the Dutch study, the average child was 15. And 15, to some extent, makes more sense than 12, right? If you look at a 15 or 16-year-old who's been this way for the last 12, 14 years, it's much easier to conceptually buy that perhaps they would be cross-sex identified for the rest of their life. But even that has never been tested, right? And of course, the arbitrary age of 12, that seems to be essentially manufactured, not because of any sort of magic. If you are still cross-sex identified at 12 years and one day, you're a future transsexual. But if you're 11 years and 364 days, we don't know yet. You probably not.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot that went into that. There are the Dutch laws that went into it. There's kind of the slippery slope thinking that once you say some of these kids are true transsexuals and some false, it sort of goes, it starts pushing down, down, and down. And of course, once puberty blockers were invented, their use was invented for this particular condition. Then, of course, why would you wait to 54, 15. Of course, you want to get to the early stages of puberty. So it became a slippery slope.
Abbruzzese went on to point out that the biggest cohort of child patients currently undergoing gender transition are those who explicitly are excluded from the Dutch protocol. That is, young people who experience gender dysphoria after puberty. She puts the blame for this great rise in the numbers of medically treated children in the United States on the fact that the medical system in the United States, which is based on private insurance, incentivizes the use of more expensive and invasive treatment. Culturally, the change is largely because of the predominance of a third position in the treatment of children with gender dysphoria. All children who express a cross-gender identity are trans. It is a human right for a child's gender identity to be recognised. The role of the clinician is to affirm the child's subjective feelings. In June 2023, the Welsh Government tweeted that their LGBTQ+ action plan had been praised by the United Nations. In truth, it had been praised by the United Nations independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, who evidently has bought into the queer theory goal of dissolving the binary oppositions. In November 2021, Madrigal Borlos was a guest on an online conference, virtual queer workshop, Gender Theory in Practice. Explaining the design of reports that he would be presenting to the United Nations General Assembly, Madrigal Borlos stated,
is that the design of these reports is the result of a deliberate intent on my part to describe two paths that the international community has before it at this time. The first path describes an inclusionary approach that, in my view, results from the best features of international human rights law. This is a discipline that constantly optimizes its capacity to redress injustice and inequality, invisible to previous generations or deliberately made invisible by the actions of previous generations. And the other path describes an exclusionary approach that, in my view, defends orders in which most of the injustice that exists in the world today have been built. And they exploit preconception, stigma, and prejudice and create an atmosphere of panic and moral concern, and in my view, are tools for the perpetuation of violence and discrimination, mostly against women, girls, trans, and intersex persons, as well as gay men and bisexual persons. The inquiry that I carried out in relation to gender also touches upon the significant concern that appears to exist over the challenging of the binary. And I conclude that there is a reason why language is important in relation to this, and it's that just like injustice has been crafted on a binary key over the last many decades, justice has been also expressed in binary terms. And so, of course, there is significant sensations of vertigo when the challenging of the binary appears to seek dismantling all binary structures, because yes, on the one hand, they would aim at disrupting injustice, but on the other hand, there is significant concern that it would destroy social achievements that have been also crafted in that key.
Queer theorists need the concepts of gender and gender identity to be able to dissolve the binary oppositions between male and female and heterosexual and homosexual. Hence, the teaching of these concepts is motivated not by science, but by politics. In the RSE Code and Guidance, the Welsh Government have mandated that children from age 7 are taught that their gender is their subjective feelings of themselves, rather than being a synonym for sex. This message is emphasised by Brook, who provide training for teachers and youth workers, as well as children. It does not take a George Orwell to deduce that this change in the meaning of words will result in more children identifying as trans and non-binary, which is precisely what queer theorists want. More than that, the impact of queer theory throws into stark relief the difference between the evidence underpinning the recommendations contained within the Interim Caste report and the evidence referenced by the Welsh Government in their recommendations regarding gender transition within the LGBTQ+ action plan. In January 2020, a policy working group was established by NHS England to undertake a review of the published evidence on the use of puberty blockers and feminising, masculinising hormones in children and young people with gender dysphoria, to inform a policy position on their future use. Assessments of the quality of the evidence in support of such medical intervention were undertaken by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. The evidence was not deemed strong enough to form the basis of a policy position. In her interim report, Dr. Cass concluded that it was important to view social transition as an active intervention, because it may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning. In June 2023, it was announced that puberty blockers in England would only be administered as part of clinical research. In contrast, within the LGBTQ+ action plan, it states, delaying or preventing a person from having their identity respected can have a negative impact on their lives. With a reference to a paper by Florence Ashley, it goes on, research has shown the harms of delayed transition, with UK-based research demonstrating the challenges, frustration and trauma of trans people, including young people who've experienced rejection and delay. There is evidence that indicates the positive impact of prepubertal social transition. Research on socially transitioned trans children has shown positive mental health and well-being outcomes. The plan continues. The cited research is among the many reasons that encourage us to do more and to continue to develop our gender services for adults in Wales and to consider options for the development of a gender service for young people in Wales. This will include an evidence-driven approach and engagement with young people, service users and stakeholders. In the abstract of the referenced article by Ashley, it states, arguing that exploration is best seen not as a precondition to transition-related care, but as a process that can operate throughout transitioning, the article concludes that the gender-affirmative approach to trans youth care best fosters youth's capacity for healthy exploration, unbounded social transition, and ready access to puberty blockers ought to be treated as the default option, and support should be offered to parents who have difficulty accepting their youth. The Welsh Government have fully committed to the social transition of children within the school system. Those parents who would prefer that their child weren't encouraged to get on the plane may wish to support Public Child Protection Wales. Links are included below.